and the presentation is More Than Metaphor, How Software Confirms the Reality of Consciousness.
Thanks. Hi everybody and welcome. This has been kind of a personal journey for me for a few years. Started about 7 years ago when I saw a video, which I'll show you in a few minutes. First, before I even begin, I want to get a sense of, was anybody here at my presentation last year? I don't think so, right? Good, so it's all new stuff. The other thing is, have any of you done any programming at all? A few of you. Okay, so I'm in over my head a little bit. Because I've done a little bit of programming, I'll explain it to you. So about last year I was up in Big Bear, and I was sitting outside, and a fly landed on a table in front of me. And I was looking at this little fly twitching and with the wings moving and everything. And because of some of the work I've been doing, which I'll show you in a minute, I realized that this fly was running the same operating system that we are, that all life is, right? DNA. And I was struck by that very deeply because it's not a metaphor. It really is what's going on. We talk about computers as metaphors very often. We use terms like rebooting our brain, our hard drive, or we run out of energy, or whatever it is. But the metaphorical aspect, or the non-metaphorical aspect of DNA being software, struck me very deeply, and I want to share it with you, and I hope maybe it can open many people's eyes to the reality of consciousness. What's the big deal? If you follow my thought processes, and I hope you do, I think you'll come to the same realization that I did, that there's no way that DNA could exist without a programmer of some kind. All our other software that we've ever used, we know how it works. Even though software is a relatively new development in our lifetimes or in our society. So we know about encoded intelligence. It's been around for a long time, maybe even all the way back to the cave drawings of Lascaux. We had ideas and concepts encoded with symbols. But when we created computers, they changed the game completely. Because with computers, we have active encoded intelligence. What's going on with computers is that our software is actually performing tasks. It's a different animal or a different being altogether. And what really changed me was a video that I saw about 6 or 7 years ago by a geneticist. His name is Juan Enriquez. It was on TED. I'm only going to play you about 2 minutes of it, but it's so powerful and so important in terms of going into the rest of the presentation. I want to share it with you. Let's see.
Let's put it next to it.
I'm going to repeat it. So I'm going to go through that a little, I'm going to review that a little bit, because maybe you didn't hear it quite right. But what he said was that a flower is or an apple is an application. And when it gets enough input from the sun, it executes its code, and it drops in the branch. And he was also talking about the fact, he was also talking about how it executes its code. It executes its code from left to right and top to bottom, right? And it reads each line of code, and then they said it makes a stem, makes a flower of a certain quality with certain features. And that's exactly, of course, how our software works. And some of you are programmers, and we're going to look into that a little more carefully. What he said was both are software. What I put up here is, this is his Ebola, sequenced Ebola ACTGs, DNA. And what I put up here is simply HTML code, which determines, of course, how a web page displays in a web browser. And if you look at inside your code, as many of you know, for example, if you search for a JPEG file, you'll see that it references a picture, and then that picture will display in the web browser. It's all very exact. The syntax is very important, and if you break the syntax slightly, there'll be a bug in your program. And the same thing is true of course, with DNA. If it executes incorrectly or it gets offline a little bit, things will go wrong. But we know how our computer software has been created. It's been created by teams of programmers, large companies, brilliant people, intentionally, with specific purposes in mind, right? So how does something that came into our bodies and has been in existence for billions of years and is basically the operating system for all of life, where did that come from? I don't have an answer to that question. I'm going to give you a couple of ideas near the end, but to me, that question is paramount in terms of opening us up to some different ways of looking at reality. And even atheists like Richard Dawkins have talked about how odd it is to them that computer code and DNA are so similar, but he doesn't draw any inference from it. I'm not going to try to make an argument for God. In fact, I'm going to talk about God a little bit later on, possibly, if I have the time. But it's just odd to me that an atheist would even notice that. And what I think DNA really is, what I want to kind of point out to you, is that it's a programming language, like C# or anything else, but it's organic. Instead of using ones and zeros, it uses chemicals in our body, proteins, to express itself. And of course, there's 4 proteins that are represented by the letters A, C, T, and G, which we've used the English language as symbols for DNA, the same way that we use symbols in English language to program HTML for web pages. So it's just two different ways of performing the same kinds of tasks, but both tasks are intentional, clearly. Because all code is symbols. ACTG is symbol, words are symbols. And all symbols have meaning. Now here's the key point that I want to make. In order for there to be meaning, there has to be a mind. There's no meaning without a mind. Otherwise you have chaos, you have entropy, you have basic nonsense. And it doesn't matter whether those symbols are images, words, letters, ACTG, or as I said, whether they're proteins and whether they're found in DNA. In both cases, both of these cases, there's meaning encoded in the material, and to me that suggests the mind. So the big deal as far as the confluence of DNA and software to me is that there must be, it's the first indication to me, we look for intelligent life in outer space. The reality is there's intelligent life in all of our cells. Because programmed information cannot exist without intentionality and some form of mind. So if you look a little bit deeper into some of the code that we use, this is a simple macro. And in this macro, in the VBA programming language that we use to control Microsoft Office, we have created a red rectangle. And the shade of red is determined by these 3 color values. Many of you know that, RGB color values. And if you change that number, then the color changes, of course. The actual results change as well. The same thing happens in DNA. We can begin to move DNA from one organism to another. And habits are also sort of like macros. If you remember what Dr. Enriquez said in the video, I'm sorry if somebody didn't hear it, there was input from the sun. All macros are basically subroutines, repetitive keystrokes that are coded based on an input. So it's usually a mouse click or something else happens that launches the macro. It's the same principle as what Dr. Enriquez talked about. There's a certain threshold of energy that was reached by the apple from the energy from the sun, and then that code executes. It's exactly the same principle. I used to teach end users how to use computers, and one of the really big points that I made was the difference between a file and a program. And what we're talking about here are programs, and as I said, it's a completely different kind of being. And one way to look at that is if you remember your history with computers, I've had it a little bit longer than many of you have, a little bit older, but when Windows first came out, or the Mac, you could move all your files from one computer to another without any problem. You could even move your programs. You could move Microsoft Word from one computer to another. And then the registry came in. So what that meant to me, the way I interpret that is, all of a sudden, every program had to live in its own world. It had to establish a connection with its world. And so each program on a new computer has to be reinstalled. To me, this speaks to the tremendous difference between files and programs, and how programs are active elements. They actually do things in the real world. I'm going to go through a couple of things, a couple of more similarities. We now know we can copy and paste HTML, we can copy and paste Microsoft Word, but because DNA is also code, we can copy and paste life. That's actually what he was talking about in that video at the very beginning. He talked about resurrecting a species that was already almost extinct. A couple of years ago on 60 Minutes, I don't know how many of you may have seen it, Leslie Stahl did a similar statement. What she pointed out was that there was a species of cat called the Arabian sand cat that was almost extinct. So what they did was they took the DNA from the Arabian sand cat and they put it into the egg of a regular house cat, and when it came to term, what came out was an Arabian sand cat. All that was exchanged was the information, the zeros and ones, right? And it was like copying and pasting life. We know this way we work. All of us copy and paste all the time. That's how we get our videos to come up on YouTube. We paste the code into a blog or a web page or whatever, and then the video expresses through that web browser. We've also, and in genetics, they've already developed programming languages to change bacteria around. So DNA is more and more can be looked at as an organic programming language. Going back to the macro deal, there was a story a while back about how they created their first synthetic synthetic life. But it wasn't quite right because they didn't create the life. What they did was they synthesized the DNA. And again, they put the DNA into a bacteria and it became alive. What they were doing was trying to get the least number of genes that would work and the most basic kind of genome that they could to establish what the baseline was for life. What's interesting was that a lot of the stuff that they found was important, that they had to include, they couldn't account for. Sometimes they call this stuff junk DNA, but that's not quite right. It's just something that we don't quite understand at this point. We've also, in genetics, have been able to actually edit our DNA with some new technology called CRISPR. Maybe you've been reading about that. And in terms of junk DNA, this just came out last week in Nature. I saw this article. What they discovered was that of the 1% of DNA that they know activates proteins and how it works and how it's sequenced and so on, the other 99% is used to regulate that. So when there's regulation, once again that points to levels of meaning or layers of meaning that suggests to me that we have to account for the fact that we have to kind of accept the fact that there has to be some mental component to this in some way. And the final example I want to use is with senses. With computers, we have an application programming interface so that, for example, a camera represents your eye and it has a certain kind of information. And then in your brain, you've got different kind of processing. So we have an optic nerve that basically runs between the two and somehow coordinates that data or converts that data. In our organic programming language, we have similar APIs that must be existing in our brains through the optic nerve in order to let us actually see things and have what Deepak calls qualia, the experience of what we're actually seeing, hearing, or whatever. And I would contend that every one of our senses has some kind of an API, something analogous to an application programming interface biologically. It's possible, maybe a previous speaker might have covered that. I thought she might have been covering something similar. If you've used a web form, you've also experienced another phenomenon with coding that speaks to the fact of how intelligent it is and how intentional it is and how precise it is. So in a web form, a simple web form, let's say, that determines whether or not you get a credit card, right? So you have a variable that's set that holds your name. You know, you fill out the form and your name goes into a variable. Maybe the word name is simply the variable. And then there's another variable, it could be the letter X, that holds the value for your income, let's say. And then there's an operational statement like if then, it says if your income is above a certain level, we'll issue you a credit card. That's how a web form actually works. If DNA works the same way, then we have to assume that there's variables and different components in DNA that do the same processes. And it speaks to, again, once again, to a deep level of sophistication. So, what is the scientific explanation for all this? This is these next few slides are just from a NASA video, which explain the origin of life according to NASA. And at some point, it said how diverse life is and how complex DNA can be in terms of distributing different features in different life forms. But they never explained how. And in fact, they glossed right over this one area, which is how does chemistry lead to qualia or experience or anything else? And Fred Hoyle, who was a famous astronomer, was talking about the origin of life. And he too was even saying that it couldn't be an accident because the appearance of life suddenly, the analogy he gave was if a tornado went through a junkyard and assembled a 747 completely functional, that would be what you'd have to assume was happening if life happened accidentally through a lightning bolt hitting a swamp or some other kind of theory. But now we do kind of know what's going on because we've had software now with personal experience for decades. And we know that this part over here is software. It's the same stuff. And it's only been in maybe the last few decades that we have a frame of reference for understanding what that really means. Because again, if we compare the software that we use every day, so that every time you swipe on a cell phone or you do something on the computer, the code is executing. The input is happening the same way that Dr. Enriquez was talking about the input from the sun hitting the apple and having it drop from the tree. So I want to go back to this concept, which I think is so important. There has to be meaning in this code, and there can't be any meaning without mind. So again, DNA is essentially like our operating system, and one of my favorite authors is Eckhart Tolle. And Eckhart Tolle says that there's a higher intelligence that runs your different, what she called them last session, autonomic functions, your automatic functions, your breathing, your digestion, your elimination, all your bodily functions are run automatically by a higher intelligence. That higher intelligence is operated through code that we sequenced and discovered its meanings to a great extent. But there's one big difference. I remember when I was teaching people software, and I was writing articles about it, I would sometimes have to write an article under a tight deadline. And all I would do is try and learn the very basics of the software that I was doing, so I could maybe open a file and capture a couple of screens and then write about it. And so I kind of just scratched the surface of what the software could do, and then I went on to the next program, as opposed to opening a manual and really studying it. And I think that's what modern genetics is doing. Modern genetics is basically playing with the code, but they don't have the manual yet. They're working on that. There's maps of the brain and so on. But in terms of the context of how it came, we don't know how it came to be, and it's an open question. But in terms of the context, what it speaks to is that there's a far greater intelligence that must have been at work at some time that was not human. And of course, we know that it's gotten very big. We've got incredibly more information about the genome. We know that it's not, we used to think that genetics basically determined us, right? Now we know that with epigenetics, we're part of a system. Our organic programming language is getting information from the environment, and that determines what genes express and how they operate and so on. We also know that we're not just one organism. We know that there are millions of organisms in our gut that are interacting all the time, and that results in our experience in our lives and so on. So the complexity of it is, to my mind, not sufficient to really make the point that I'm trying to make. But the way that it operates, with layers of meaning and regulation, suggests to me that there has to be some kind of source mind. And I don't have an answer for that. I'm not here to preach creationism or so on. I think deeper questions can open us up to much further and deeper investigation. There's one teaching that I want to point out. Have any of you heard of Dr. Robert Lanza and biocentrism? Dr. Lanza is a pretty famous scientist. He works in the eye area with stem cells. And he came up with this concept of biocentrism, which is the notion that reality is really based on our biology. In other words, we have the five senses that we know about, possibly other senses, and that determines our reality. So his contention is that physics, or biophysics, needs to eventually become an extension of biology. So I'm kind of running out of time. I just want to kind of finish up here. What's my conclusion? I'm not here to preach about God. In fact, going back to that notion about the web form and the variables, one way I like to look at all words, and particularly the word God, is it's like a variable. It's like the ultimate variable, because it has no real meaning in and of itself until you fill it up with meaning. And the emptiness concept speaks to me very, very powerfully about how intelligence might have come into the world. And the only thing I can really say or that we can say, I think, with some certainty, that because computer code and DNA are exactly the same, and we know how computers came into existence intentionally through the agency of intelligent programmers, I can't say whether it's still here or whether it was at one time. I don't want to get into aliens, but there must have existed at one time a much higher level of intelligence. And to me, what this does is it breaks through the hubris of modern science that takes for granted the fact that we have objective knowledge about things without being in a posture of awe to an intelligence that's far greater than our own. In fact, this is the way I look at it. What I think life really is, and that's just my theory, is infinitely intelligent energy. I want to conclude with one more thing about Eckhart Tolle. One of my favorite books is A New Earth. And many of you may remember that in the first chapter, if you read A New Earth, first chapter it just got me immediately. Because he talks about how for millions of years there were just water lilies, or there were just plants. And then one day, now you could call it a mutation, or you could call it, I think he refers to it as a shift or an increase in consciousness. All of a sudden, the first flower appeared. Never had been one before. And then, of course, more flowers and more flowers. I think that's kind of how our consciousness will hopefully evolve if we're open to the notion that DNA and software are so similar. So I want to leave you with this thought, which is that DNA is software, and so are we. So thank you very much. I want to plug my book. My book is called If DNA is Software, Who Wrote the Code? And I've got some postcards for it if you're interested. Thank you very much for your attention. Hope you enjoyed this presentation.